What do you think has been the biggest misconceptions about COVID, about the vaccine, or about ivermectin?
The biggest misconception about COVID has been that we could get rid of the virus. So this thinking that if we just do X, Y, Z, and if everybody just did X, Y, Z, this would go away. I think that's a huge misconception that a lot of people had that I think is obviously shifting. A lot of people are realizing it doesn't really matter what you do. It's here. I think the biggest misconception about ivermectin is that it's a horse drug. It's actually a drug that won the the inventor or the person who discovered it won the Nobel Prize for that discovery because of what it does for humans. It's a human drug that they found also works in animals for various things, but it was one that was found for humans and used for humans and has been used for humans. So that that misconception that it's a horse drug, also that it, also the misconception that it, that there's a misconception that it works. People say it's false that it works against COVID. It is actually, the studies show are not false that it works. We have numerous case studies that show that it actually does have benefit against COVID. So is it a magic bullet, a cure? No. But is it better than nothing? Yeah. And that people deserve to know that. But of course, we're not getting there's no media attention onto that. It's just been all the eggs were put in the vaccine basket. And then now we've got all these people who've been double vaccinated and they're getting the virus, and they've done everything that they were told to do. And yet there's still no real early treatment for them that is being promoted or heavily researched. Ivermectin obviously being out of the patent for Merck. So they're not able to make any money off of it anymore. It's really, really cheap, so obviously they have a reason to want to discourage its use. Mm. And not saying that that's the best end all be all, and there could be something else that comes along that maybe Merck does manufacture something that ends up being better and more effective. I don't know, but we should be looking at anything and everything. We should be throwing everything at this virus that we can. And I think the biggest misconception about the vaccines is that they stop the spread, and they just don't. So we don't even know at this point. It's really unclear with the data how much they even slow the spread and for how long they slow the spread. That is really debated. So
that's the whole thing with these boosters now, right? It's almost out there now that we're gonna need to start taking boosters every 6 months or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So it's unclear. It's still really unclear with the boosters. Israel's the first country to roll that out. It does look from just early data that the boosters are working to help lessen the severity of COVID for those who are, who catch it, who are elderly or who have hypertension or diabetes or, any of these other sort of comorbidities that make the outcome more potentially severe. It does seem like those boosters are helping with that. But we don't know for how long that'll last. We don't know if that'll last with a different variant. We don't know anything about the side effects at all of taking a third. That was never studied in any clinical trial. They tried to do like real quick impromptu clinical trials of like, okay, what will happen if we give people a third dose? But they don't have any data really on that besides short term. So when people are afraid of long-term side effects with even just the first 2 doses, we really don't know anything when it comes to a third. So, I think just the fact, thinking that it can stop the spread, then people will say, well, okay, Israel shows it wears off, but you at least have protection for 6 to 8 months, but not against spread. Iceland shows us that they inoculated the majority of their population June and July, and in August had the largest spike of cases they've ever seen during the pandemic. So we're seeing that over and over and over again. We're not seeing the opposite. So I would believe data, I always believe the data, and we're just simply not seeing any data right now that shows once you mass vaccinate, the spread goes away. We haven't seen a single instance of that. In fact, we've only seen the opposite now over a dozen times in a dozen highly inoculated countries. So I think it's really safe to say at this point that that's just not the case. At first they said, well, it's because they took the Chinese vaccine, right? Because it was Chile that had the first mass inoculation and then mass wave of COVID after that. And they say, well, they took that crappy Chinese vaccine. And then it was like, well, you can't say that. You can't say that about Seychelles. You can't say that about Israel. You can't say that, a bunch of countries after, country after country after country just couldn't say that about anymore. So we don't have a lot of good data on like Moderna, for example, or Johnson & Johnson. So it's still yet to be seen with those. But AstraZeneca, we have a good example with the UK. They pretty much exclusively took AstraZeneca. We see that it still causes massive spread. They're saying, well, I guess we just have to live with it. Israel's now kind of saying, I guess we're going to have to. Israel tried to say we're going to have to live with it. And their population was like, no. They didn't like that their politicians were saying, I think it's time for us to realize we have to live with this. And so now they're like going on and talking about fourth booster doses. Their COVID czar just came out Saturday saying, get ready for a fourth.
So do you know if in other countries there's been the level of propaganda that we're seeing in the US? Because what I find particularly disconcerting is not just that information is being suppressed or censored or flagged, but that we're seeing false news stories. So like with Rolling Stone, for example, when they were saying that people weren't being able to get treated for gunshot wounds because people were taking ivermectin and being treated for that. Yeah. And then they had to issue a retraction. And also the image that they used for that story was actually an image of people lining up not to be treated for gunshot wounds, but to get the COVID vaccine. So it just, it seems as though there's just so much censorship, so much just lies that are happening on this. Is that the case in other countries as well?
Not from what I'm seeing. So from what I'm, I do take the time to read the news publications coming out of other countries, and I even translate them, using Google Translate. I'll get the actual news from these various other areas. And I am not seeing this level of propaganda, maybe in Australia and Canada, maybe even in the UK, but only those countries. And it seems that the other countries are not, maybe Germany, if I had to be fair, maybe France. So I think there's some that there's like a small group of Western countries that I think are maybe fueling more fear and propaganda for either monetary interest. I mean, I would say, I suspect here in the United States that a lot of that is largely based on our pharmaceutical industry and the fact that our government has been bought off by big money interests for a really long time. But in other countries,
and
I would say
the news networks too. I mean, I remember watching the CBS nightly news, and every commercial was a big pharma
drug ad. Yeah, big pharma, and that's funny because people always say, "Oh, Fox is like anti-vax," and I'm like, "Have you been watching? Clearly, you don't watch Fox. If you're just saying that Fox is anti-vax, they're not anti-vax at all. They can't be. One of their largest advertisers is pharmaceutical companies. I mean, they're making a boatload off of pharma, so they're not anti-vax at all on Fox. It's just that's the narrative that people are being told." And CNN is spewing that, and MSNBC is spewing that, and then you watch Fox. And they're like, get the vaccine. We've got the vaccine. Everybody here has been vaccinated.
Right.
So I do think that our media is very bought off. Our government is very bought off. Other countries, I'm not seeing as much of that, particularly the Scandinavian countries. They're operating, Iceland gives amazing amounts of data. If you go to their website, their government website, Iceland is so refreshingly transparent. I mean, they tell you what percentage of their people have the vaccine and are unvaccinated to who's caught the virus. It's the graphs and the charts are there, and they're showing that it was pretty much equal, that the percentage of the population that was vaccinated to unvaccinated, it was equal amounts who caught the virus. So they had 70% of their cases were vaccinated and 30% were unvaccinated. Well, that's the population percentage of who's vaccinated and who's unvaccinated. They also show you the data from week by week, the percentage of those people and the spread. And when you look at their chart, what's really interesting is their first week or two of spread, this wave, fully vaccinated people were the ones spreading them. No unvaccinated people were in the cases. So that kind of goes against this whole narrative that we have here in the United States of it's the unvaccinated fault. They're the reason for the spread, and it's because they won't get vaccinated that the spread is happening. And then when you go look at Iceland's data, their first week or two of this wave, they don't have any undocumented cases, unvaccinated documented cases in that beginning bit. So Iceland now has a very different, they're singing a different song, and they're saying, look, we hoped that this vaccine would work. It's not working as we hoped. It does work to limit severity. The elderly, those who have comorbidities should be taking this. It's helping them. And we're going to have to figure out a different path forward, as we move on. And, I think we're seeing that come. And Denmark is now saying Sweden was right. They had a better path. We're just going to have to learn to live with this. And we're going to have to try our best to live alongside the virus and try to mitigate damage as much as possible while still living our lives, because this thing's not going away. But other than the Scandinavian countries, yeah. And of course, Asia has a whole different view. They're not even mass vaccinating that quickly. So they have a very different viewpoint. They're really slow to vaccinate over there. Japan was fast because they were being forced to for the Olympics. But other than that, and China says that they're fast, but I don't know about China's data on any of it.